Alright, in this video I want to talk a little bit about the so-called Great American Eclipse and then relate that just a little bit towards the end to what transpired in East Palestine, Ohio. I'm sure most of you are aware of the image that's up on the screen, which is showing the two paths of the total solar eclipses that are referred to as the Great American Eclipse. The first path was on August 21st, 2017, and then the second path will be in a little over a year from now in April of 2024, and you can see that the two paths here form this ominous looking X over the United States of America. So before going further, let's read a little bit about this. The Great American Eclipse. Today's astrologers are no different. They see this August 21st Great American Eclipse as the harbinger of a major turning point for the U.S. Put succinctly, in astrology's astrologic, what happens above in the heavens is like qualitatively similar to what happens below in the realm of kickable objects. So what it looks like in the sky becomes a metaphor for how it might play out in the course of human events. Let's use the Great American Eclipse as an example of how this works. Location, location, location. First, the location from which an eclipse is visible indicates the areas of the world ripe for changes in society, cultures, or leadership. Now I have to interject here the obvious, which you really won't find anybody discussing astrology acknowledging because they're too heavily indoctrinated with the conventional wisdom to realize that the powers that be have been around for so long that they have this information in a way that the general public does not. They know about all of these cycles that are going on, and they plan their agenda with the cycles in mind. In other words, someone who is a self-described astrologer would do all kinds of readings and look at the positions of everything and say, okay, in these conditions, we see these types of things. And then they look around and they say, oh, and you can see this event or that event exemplifying this trend. What they're missing is the fact that no, those trends are taking place because the powers that be know the environment is ripe for them to accelerate a certain portion of their agenda. They know that the energy of a certain window, based on all of this going on cosmically, is going to be very favorable to a particular aspect of their agenda. And that's why these things seem to line up. It's very important that you understand what's really going on here. Now, saying all of that, of course, outside of its agenda, sure, these things are operating on levels that are subtle enough to be influencing you without knowing it until someone points it out. So anyways, moving on. First, the location from which an eclipse is visible indicates the areas of the world ripe for changes in society, cultures, or leadership. There's a reason why ancient kings and emperors beheaded astrologers who failed to predict eclipses. They wanted fair warning for threats to the country or their authority. Of course, the Great American Eclipse puts the U.S. in the crosshairs of change. It's the first total solar eclipse to be visible coast to coast across the U.S. in nearly 100 years. The last time was in June 1918, another pivotal year in U.S. history. 1918 saw a dramatic increase in the size of the U.S. government and armed forces as the nation sent the first major deployment of troops overseas in the nation's history. This is referring to World War I, obviously. And incidentally, this was also when one of the first well-known pandemics occurred, referred to in the press as the Spanish flu, when the reality, of course, it didn't have anything to do with the Spanish. That was just what the label was given to it. And I did a video on that a few years ago now, going into what most likely happened during the Spanish flu. The August 21st eclipse is also the first total solar eclipse to be visible in totality only from the U.S. since the nation was founded in 1776. The Great American Eclipse certainly fits its name. Symbolism of Saros 145. No eclipse stands alone. All are part of a larger family of eclipses called a Saros series. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. All I can think of is Sauron. Saros, so that's how I'm pronouncing it. Each Saros series begins at either the North or South Pole. Then, over the next 1,300 years, it develops from partial to total as it moves toward the equator, then dwindles back to partial as it ends at the opposite pole. The Great American Eclipse is part of a Saros series 145. So to get sense of how August's eclipse may play out, astrologers look to past events in the series. For example, the first eclipse in Saros 145 occurred in 1639, just weeks before the signing of the first state constitution for Connecticut. Saros 145 eclipses have a long history appearing before major events in U.S. history, including the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945 and the assassination of JFK in 1963. Now, anyone reading the news understands that President Trump enjoys being at the center of attention. Again, this is 2017 in the lead up to the first path of the eclipse. So, of course, Donald Trump was still president. While the Great American Eclipse is certainly part of the script to make America great, and Trump may have been the man destined to make it happen. For starters, the August 21st eclipse occurs conjunct the fixed star Regulus. As the lion's heart of the constellation Leo, Regulus since ancient times has been associated with kings and kingship. A solar eclipse conjunct Regulus would have been an omen for the fall of the king, and most certainly not news a court astrologer would want to have to deliver to his royal patron. It's funny, I'm thinking of John Dee as I'm reading this, who was famously the court astrologer and the original 007, two-ball Cain, right? And John Dee was much more than an astrologer when you look into the history of that character. And if that weren't enough, the Great American Eclipse falls directly on the point that was rising over the horizon at the moment of President Trump's birth, assuming the birth certificate released by the campaign is accurate. The rising degree is one of the most pivotal points in a horoscope, aka a birth chart, one that changes every 4 minutes as the Earth churns. So an eclipse on the Star of Kings, especially when it falls so precisely on the birth chart of the leader of the country over which the eclipse occurs, becomes the astrological equivalent of a Vegas-style flashing neon sign. Oh, and by the way, let's not forget President Trump was born on the day of a lunar eclipse. So as an eclipse baby himself, he's even more sensitive to their triggering influence. This is what I was going into before. I don't know what to tell you if you can't see how all of this is intentional. This isn't some accident of history. You know what I mean? I don't know what to tell you if you can't see how this is just statistically unlikely to be a coincidence. Moving on. On August 21st, 2017, we remember the solar eclipse that crossed the United States from the Pacific Northwest to the Southeast. It was called the Great American Eclipse. What makes that eclipse unique is that 7 years later, on April 8th, 2024, there is another solar eclipse that is also going to cross the U.S., but it comes from the opposite direction. The path of these two eclipses form an X over the country, with the intersection being in the Midwest, in a town called Carbondale, Illinois, which is also known as Little Egypt. We're going to stretch the limits of coincidence here. So if you're a coincidence theorist, this is going to be a very difficult video for you. When I read about the intersection town being called Little Egypt, I knew in my spirit that there was more to the story. So I looked Carbondale, Illinois up to find out why it is also called Little Egypt. Apparently back in the 1830s, there was a crop failure in the Midwest, and many people were hungry in northern Illinois. So they started wandering to different locations looking for food, which they found in Carbondale, Illinois. It was then that they actually associated themselves with the story of Joseph and the famine, thus declaring that Carbondale was like Egypt with plenty of food, so it was nicknamed Little Egypt. So again, going back to the map that I had up here, they're referring to the intersection right here, which you can see is Carbondale, Illinois, like just a little bit away from the center. I think it goes through directly a forest area, but Carbondale is the nearest town. And incidentally, this whole area is really interesting as it relates to the mound builders lore. For those of you who aren't familiar, these are structures that were built into the Earth's surface, literally building dirt mounds, that just so happen to also have astronomical alignments built into them. And this is a huge problem in the historical narrative, at least from the mainstream perspective, because they tell us that everyone who existed on the continent of America prior to Europeans coming over here was inhabited by people who didn't have knowledge of the stars in this way, that wouldn't have advanced mathematical knowledge to encode earthworks with that kind of sophistication. But Cahokia is in Illinois, not too far from Carbondale. It's about a 2-hour drive. And Serpent Mound is over here in southwest Ohio. And so this whole area is surrounded by the mound builder culture. And what's so funny is there's even a state park just north of Carbondale that's called Giant City State Park. And that's kind of just a laugh out loud name for a state park in this area when you consider that the mound builders are closely associated with the idea of giants existing in the past as well. So just a whole really interesting thing going on here, in addition to the fact that this town is known as Little Egypt. And along those lines, I wanted to read a comment from someone who's been leaving comments here and there on my YouTube channel for many years now. And I hope he or she doesn't mind me reading this, but it's incredible work. So let me just start with, at the beginning, April 8th, 2024. The date of the second Great American Eclipse, less than 2 years away. Both of these eclipses form an X over the heart of America, intersecting over Little Egypt, Illinois, which has an area code of 618, symbolically indicating the phi ratio. This is like the area code of Manhattan being 212 prior to the Twin Towers becoming one tower. I went into that in an older video on the phone number at the Millennium Hilton, which will tie into East Palestine in the sense of, esoterically speaking, or in a more abstract way of thinking, the end of Back to the Future Part 3, which of course encoded 9/11 into it, has Doc Brown's time machine in the form of a train fly directly into the screen. And this is expanding upon the theme that is in that whole series of the monolith being the movie screen, it being the way that they are transcending the human mind into something else. And then you have Westworld, the reboot of it, start with the train coming into the western United States, a desert-like area. And then they blatantly show you the truth of what's going on as it relates to the loops that are going on and all the characters that are in Westworld. And that's a whole nother video. But obviously that relates to the idea of a train derailing and exploding in East Palestine, but we'll get to that with the way that everything is symbolically resonating around that event when we get there. Let me continue reading before I get distracted here. The magnetic torus field that flows out of the heart and the Earth on the next scale up operating according to the phi ratio, if you observe how a toroidal structure operates, it gives everything away, as has been stated, only to receive everything it has been given up on the other side. This is speaking of magnetism. Symbolically, the luminaries of the sun and moon are crossing, this is the X, out the heart, or the Earth, heart being an anagram for Earth. Within Little Egypt, Illinois, 618 phi ratio heart Earth is a city called Cairo. Cairo in Egypt is where the Nile, anagram for line, ends. This is where the line, or Nile, of man ends and begins to bifurcate or split, as the choice will be presented to humanity a fractal echo of the same choice that doomed us as described in the book of Genesis, as the beginning meets the end. Humanity will bifurcate just as the Nile, line of man, splits as it goes back to source, the ocean. Relating Little Egypt, Cairo, and the Nile to this great American eclipse in this way, and the mound builders, the star maps, the way that the Great Pyramid at Giza is aligned to Sirius and other star systems, the way all of that was built into it, having all of that taking place right here is really interesting in the context of what happened in East Palestine, because the Ohio River, of course, eventually filters into the Mississippi River that then comes down all the way out into the ocean. In other words, if you have the bifurcation idea in mind, you have one of the rivers here being poisoned. We have this symbolic poisoning of one of the rivers that is flowing through Little Egypt. I believe the Mississippi River is right on the border of Illinois and Missouri as it flows down into the ocean. And the Ohio River eventually connects into it. And expanding on that theme, as a part of the 2017 eclipse, it passed 7 cities named Salem in the following states: Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kentucky, and South Carolina. And here you have the 7 Salems that the 2017 eclipse passed through. You have Salem, Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming. Why would I read the states again? I just read them. I just realized that. Anyway, you have these 7 Salems that the original eclipse passed through. So going back to what went on in East Palestine, and I have to say first, there's a lot of people in the immediate area that are suffering as a result of what happened, and I don't mean to make light of that in any way or distract from that in any way. It's just unfortunate that the way things operate here, there's always these symbolic layers on top of all of these events that transpire. And that's what I'm going to go into here, but just wanted to give that disclaimer before going forward. But if you go to the original reports that were coming out when this happened, Norfolk Southern's defect detectors picked up problems before crash. And I gotta say, I don't have the picture up with me right now, but someone pointed out that Norfolk Southern's logo is a horse with 4 white stripes, like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse resonance in their logo itself. So I'll just leave that hanging out there. I don't have the picture up, but just something to consider. 30 miles west of East Palestine near Sebring, the wayside defect detectors picked up the overheating wheel bearing that the NTSB suspects caused the derailment. Another detector in Salem, about 20 miles from the crash site, showed the bearing's temperature had skyrocketed by 68 degrees in just those 10 miles. By then, the bearing's temperature was 103 degrees hotter than the surrounding air. But here's the catch. Norfolk Southern standards don't call for the train to be stopped and inspected until the bearing reaches at least 115 degrees above the outside temperature, a mere 12 degrees hotter than the reading. At the time of the next reading in East Palestine, the bearing showed a stunning 253 degrees above the air temperature, and the crew attempted to stop the train, but it was too late. These articles are so poorly written that I have to reformulate the sentences on the fly and read them to you. It's got to be AI writing it or something at this point. Anyway, you would assume someone paid to be a journalist would be able to write in proper English. But we're well past the point of no return as it relates to AI bots on the internet. So anyway, I find it very interesting in light of the fact that there were 7 Salems in the 2017 eclipse in the path of totality, and we have the path of totality in 2024 going just above East Palestine, Ohio. It goes directly through Cleveland, and then this is kind of northeast Ohio, but then East Palestine is like right down here on the border with Pennsylvania, closer to Pittsburgh, really, than Cleveland. Probably equidistant, really, probably. It's very interesting to me that it was the detector in Salem that originally picked up the problem, and then, of course, it crashes in East Palestine, and Palestine has all of this resonance to what's going on in Israel, where you have both Palestinians and Israelis laying claim to the actual city of Jerusalem. And obviously Salem is in the word Jerusalem itself, Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. So you have all this resonance to what's going on in the Middle East symbolically with Jerusalem, Israel, Palestine. This detector on the railroad picks up the brakes going bad on this train, and then it crashes in Palestine. And it's kind of symbolic of what's going on over there, right? Where Israel takes ownership of Salem, and the Palestinians are destroyed, or symbolically, right? There's an explosion and they are poisoned and not allowed to have their own land anymore that is uninhabitable at this point. And then symbolically and metaphorically, that's sort of what's going on in the country itself, as that first article was going into, from an astrological perspective, saying how this X is over America, and we have all of this energy that is divisive and blatantly attempting to dismantle what America used to be, culturally speaking, in every way that something can be dismantled. In that way, Americans are being turned into the Palestinians. We are being destroyed in our own land. It's being taken over and turned into something else right in front of our eyes. And along those lines, I do think it's interesting with this whole Salem thing, just taking it and looking at it from another angle. The word itself, Salem, is males backwards. And speaking about the culture of America being changed fundamentally, the most prevalent idea out there, as it is promoted to us via the mainstream thought form, the mainstream stream of consciousness, that is that masculinity is toxic, right? And the number one enemy is a straight white male, right? Males Salem. You have the first eclipse going through 7 Salems, or males, coincidentally, and then you have Salem being in this East Palestine story as well, and also being kind of tangentially related to the next path of totality that is forming this X over Little Egypt and Cairo. And as I'm sure all of you are aware by now, also symbolically, you have the movie that was inexplicably shot in the area of East Palestine and had extras from the town itself called White Noise, which depicted the exact event that eventually transpired in East Palestine, an airborne toxic event, is how it's described in the book and the movie. Which is just something that I don't think any of us can explain. You could come up with a million reasons for why that happened the way it did. So I think it's better if I don't even try to explain it, other than just to note that it happened. Yes, there was this movie called White Noise that came out a year before, depicting a train crash that released a toxic cloud into the atmosphere. And it was a very strange movie in that sense, that resonated with the Israel-Palestine stuff, in the sense that the professor main character was a Hitler studies scholar, and that was his specialty. And then the title itself obviously could be taken in many ways along those lines. White Noise, you see, which then also is the white noise of the television screen, right? When you have a disconnected cable, and all you get is the static, the white noise, which then ties into the whole Monolith is the movie screen, Videodrome, white noise, static theme that this event is resonating with as it relates to the train crash, the train derailments. And then it has that tie-in back to the article we read about Little Egypt and how it got its name in Carbondale from the Exodus that was taking place. People were hungry, starving, and then White Noise, the film, has this weird supermarket as the centerpiece of the narrative. That's what ties the whole thing together. It ties the stories together. And even the end line of the movie is something along the lines of, well, as long as the supermarkets are here, we know we're safe. And, you know, kind of maybe resonating with famine of some type, shape, or form. And then we have the price of food in the context of all this and the inflating dollar and how expensive everything is. And yeah, it's all just coalescing together in this way, I hope you see. But as a part of that, too, you have to remember that 10 days or so before August 21st, 2017, you had this contrived Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which tied into the Donald Trump presidency and everything they used him as the conspiracy theorist president to build into the narrative. This was sort of the beginning of it, where it went from just something that was innocent enough as Donald Trump referring to everyone as fake news, co-opting that fake news narrative that was on the internet in the process. It morphed from that to something more with this staged Unite the Right rally. And I say staged because all you have to do is look at the people who are attributed as the organizers, and they're well-known glowies, right? I mean, it's not even a question. So as these things usually are, they're organized by forces that want to create these types of narratives. And we've gone a long way from this to where we are now, leading up to the second Path of Totality in April of 2024, especially, you know, kind of right in the middle of this, at the end of 2020, the 7-year time period that is, we had the January 6th event in Washington, D.C. along these lines, or at least they attributed it in the same way along these lines. So I think that is pretty much everything I wanted to get to. I have a couple more just random pieces of information down here. When the eclipse begins in Salem, Oregon, this is 2017 they're referring to, the sun sets in Jerusalem at the exact same time. What's even more mind-blowing is that this eclipse exits the United States of America at the Isle of Palms in South Carolina, and South Carolina's flag has a palm tree on it, as well as what appears to be a solar eclipse. And this is the South Carolina flag referring to that, which is just further resonance with the Jerusalem-Salem thing that I was going into with East Palestine. So at the same time that the eclipse itself began in 2017, you have the sun setting in Jerusalem as sort of a wink and a nod, cosmically speaking, to the agenda that is being implemented in this time period. Americans are the new Palestinians, I think, is the agenda going forward, or at least that is their vision for the future. But before I finish, I do want to say, to those of you who are close to the Path of Totality in 2024, I highly encourage you to go watch the eclipse. I was fortunate enough to be in the Path of Totality in 2017, and it was a wild experience. I'm not sure if I've told this story before in an older recording. I might have, but I'll tell it again just in case I never got around to it. I was actually working on the day that it was transpiring, and I'll never forget, we were out picking peppers, talking like we usually do, just wasting time or trying to pass the time while we're doing this boring, backbreaking work. And At one point, the guy I was working with, he looks down at his watch and it says, I think it's supposed to happen soon. How will we know? And I'm like, I don't know. I've never experienced a total solar eclipse. I have no idea. And we both just kind of looked at each other like, well, I guess we'll just keep working and eventually we'll figure it out. And when it gets to the time that it was supposed to be here, I guess we'll go walk down to the barn and get the glasses and look up and see if we can see anything. And about 10 minutes later, the whole environment changed. It was incredible. You're so used to hearing birds and insects and just the noise of nature. And all of that went dead silent. Not a single noise from a bird or anything. It was very eerie in that way. And we just noticed all of a sudden, I'm looking at the plant thinking, I'm having trouble seeing this plant. What is going on? And then we both had the realization almost simultaneously, oh my gosh, it's really dark out right now. And we're looking around like, what is happening? This is wild. There's no sound. It's dark, almost like dusk, like the sun is setting. And so at that point we realized, oh my gosh, it's happening right now. And then we went and got the glasses, checked it out. But in that moment, I realized why ancient cultures would put so much emphasis behind solar eclipses, especially when you didn't have any of the technology that we have that distracts us from the sky. Back then, that's your entertainment. That's what you were paying attention to at night. Tracing the stars, looking up at the sky at night. Crystal clear skies in that way. Before any of the pollution or the artificial trails clouded things. It was a really interesting experience, and since these are so rare, I would highly recommend that you take the time to go check it out if you've never seen one before and it's close enough to be reasonably doable. I don't know if those 5 minutes would be worth a huge expense is what I'm trying to say. So don't blame me if you spend a lot of money to travel and then you're like, oh, that wasn't worth it. I'm saying, if you're like 4 or 5 hours away driving distance, totally worth that drive. But, I'm not saying spend thousands of dollars on a plane flight and a hotel and all that stuff. So anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Later.